Thank you for coming and welcome to today's Global Strategy Forum event. Our subject today is espionage, and I will get to our speaker in a moment. And I know when I say espionage, there are some in the room of an agency persuasion who come to hear tales of exploding socks and bodies ripping. This story is not like that. It is way better. It's got everything. It's about defeating Russia. Always goes down well. It's about doing better than the US. Always goes down well. And it extends to today's challenges with President Putin. So lots to get through. I'll come back to the format and introduce our speaker in a moment. But just a parish notice before we begin, which is our next event. And I say this with some trepidation, but on Wednesday the 24th of June, we're going back to Brexit. I told you. So Jenny Bates, who is the Hayward Fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford, is going to talk on the UK and the EU in the new global economic order. And as many of you know very well, the 24th of June is the 10th anniversary of the result of the 2016 Brexit referendum. Jenny, formerly of FCDO, where she was Director General for Europe and the FCDO's negotiations with the EU. The event will be chaired deliciously by Lord Philip Hammond, and invitations will go out shortly. Please, if you wish to come, respond when you see that invitation. Could I just remind you, before we get started, if you have a phone, and you have a phone, please could you turn it off or put it onto silent. So, today, the subject is this magnificent book, How One Man Tried to Kill the KGB, the story of Vasili, I'm going to get this wrong, aren't I? Mitrokhin, thank you, and what it tells us about Putin's Russia today. Our speaker really needs no introduction, but this is the GSF, and we know to get our obituaries in early. Gordon Corera, he is a co-host of the podcast The Rest is Classified, with David McCloskey, formerly of the CIA, and that looks at spies and secrets. He's well known to everybody in the room for his 25 years covering security and intelligence, including 20 years with BBC News. He's a serial author on the subject of MI6 and cyber spying and Russian agents and pigeons. And you came and talked to us about pigeons back in 2019. He'll describe it's an extraordinary story. As you know, if you are doing this kind of thing, you usually pretend you've read the book. I actually have read nearly all of it now. I didn't mean to, but it was gripping, really interesting. And paperback copies are available at the back of the room, and if you pin Gordon down, he will of course sign them on exit. So, Gordon, over
Richard,
to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Jacqueline and to everyone at GSF. It is always a pleasure to be at GSF events, and I've been a long time attendee and have had many stimulating conversations here, so it's wonderful to be able to speak to you all about actually quite an unusual and remarkable man, Vasili Mitrokhin, and the story I'll tell is partly about an individual and, as I said, an unusual individual, but it's also about Russia, and it's about Russia's relationship with the West, and it's about the rise of Vladimir Putin. And I'll try and come back to how I think it really does have quite a lot of relevance for how we got here today and how we think about Russia and the Russian state, and particularly the extent to which the security services dominate it. I'll start the story in March 1992, when a slightly scruffily dressed man pitches up at the British Embassy in Vilnius in Lithuania, one of the newly independent Baltic states, walks up to the door, asks to see someone from the embassy. He doesn't have an appointment. He is what's known colloquially as a walk-in. And he wants to see someone in the Russian language from the special services, meaning the intelligence services. And it's interesting because he's ended up at the British because, as Richard hinted at, the Americans have turned him away already. And they, for various reasons, and the details are quite interesting and a little bit murky because the Americans don't like to admit how they missed it, had decided that this was this rather odd chap who's at this point about 70 years old, scruffily dressed, pulling along a kind of shopping bag, grubby shopping bag, was not someone to be taken particularly seriously. And at that point, the Americans are thinking they're going to engage in a new relationship with the Russians. They don't necessarily want to take on someone who's claiming they've got secrets unless you're sure that they've got really good secrets. This guy just didn't seem quite right. So he's slightly bewildered by that, done what actually many have done in the past, which is try the British next. And the British intelligence made quite a good living, actually, out of picking up some of the things discarded or that the Americans have missed. There's a few other interesting cases of that going back into the Cold War. And to their credit. And he's quite lucky at this moment because he could have been dismissed again. But there was a diplomat at the embassy, a woman, not a spy, diplomat in her late 20s, but who spoke Russian, had been in Moscow. And when she engaged in conversation with this person, thought, maybe there's something interesting about him. It's just something which seems interesting. It's often those small decisions which matter. And she does that very British thing, which she says, would you like a cup of tea? And he says, yes, thank you very much. And out of his grubby bag, he starts to pull out files. Not quite original files, we'll come to that, but copies of files, which he will say are from the KGB, from the Soviet Union's intelligence service, particularly its foreign intelligence part, the first chief directorate. And he will claim these are very secret things. It's a very unequal exchange, isn't it? It's a cup of tea in exchange for the deepest secrets that the KGB had. But it starts off a sequence of events which will in time lead to Vasili Mitrokhin leaving Russia with his secrets. But at that moment, he will go back to Russia, having made this initial contact and an agreement to meet again. So who was he, and how did he come into possession of this slightly unusual bag full of secrets? And those weren't all the secrets he had. Well, his life and career is fascinating. Born 1922, early days of the Bolshevik Revolution, in a rural village in Russia. And he always loved the countryside right to the end of his life. And he had not really planned to be a Secret Service officer. Enjoyed the archives, and he'd been studying actually in Moscow as the war started, the Second World War, to be an archivist, and then had been pulled into a slightly different career path. He'd ended up becoming actually a lawyer and a prosecutor. He was a prosecutor in Ukraine as the war ended and as the Soviet Union reimposed its will and Stalin's will upon Ukraine in a particularly bloody way. And it was something which he never really talked about, but which gave him nightmares. And yet, despite that, he was a committed communist, committed to the cause of communism, who, when he was offered the chance to join the KGB, took it and became an officer of the first chief directorate, the foreign arm of the KGB, the equivalent of MI6 or CIA. The truth is, he, I don't think, was a natural fit for that. I think maybe their recruiting standards had perhaps loosened somewhat at the end of the war. He was not good at the cocktail party conversations at which you imagine spies trying to recruit diplomats and the like. His first posting, which was to Israel, did not go well. A network was compromised, whether it was his fault or not entirely clear. He then gets put on short-term assignments. These are kind of accompanying delegations and from the Soviet Union going abroad. At this stage, he's got married to Nina, who's a doctor. They've got a son, who I'll come back to, Vladimir, who is also, they will realise, ill, which is also complicating his life. But 1956, of all places, he goes to Australia, accompanying the Soviet Olympic team to the Melbourne Olympics. Quite an unusual place to go. And actually, there's a very interesting story, I won't go into it in the book, in which, again, things go wrong at the Olympics. Actually, to do with of all things, a water polo game between the Hungarian team and the Soviet team. And of course, the Hungarian uprising has just happened. And so there's tension, which actually spills over into violence in the pool for water polo. And Mitrokhin himself is blamed to some extent for not keeping a lid on events and not doing anything. So as soon as he comes back from this trip to Australia, it's decided he's not really quite up for it. He's not up to it. He, on his file is stamped, not suitable for operational work. What do you do with someone who is not suitable for operational work, but, is a bit introverted, slightly obsessive character? And the answer is, you send them to the archives. In a way, this was punishment by the KGB, a sense that this was someone who was not up to it, so this is where we can put him, basement of the Lubyanka. I would argue one of the worst HR or personnel decisions in history, it will prove to be, because it is in the archives, in the basement of the Lubyanka, the headquarters in Moscow, where a few things are going to happen. He's going to fester because he's got this grievance at having been sent there, but he's also going to see in the files the truth of what the KGB does compared to the myth that it sells the outside world, including particularly the Russian population or the Soviet population. And he will see this dissonance between the two as he sees the darker things that it's doing. He will also watch events in the outside world in the coming years, things like the Prague Spring of 1968 get crushed by the Soviet Union. And what does he see the KGB do? Well, actually, the KGB is deploying huge resources to not do traditional spying even, but to spy on other countries which are supposedly allies in the Eastern Bloc, to pose as Westerners, to try and gather intelligence on their allies, because they're fearful of what people really think of the Soviet Union and its grip. He sees things like, plans from the KGB to break the legs of Rudolf Nureyev, the ballet dancer, because he's defected. Plans to send KGB teams to chess matches because they can't bear the idea of losing a chess match. All this time, he's watching and reading this material, watching what's going on in the outside world. And what I find interesting is it's all going on in his head. He's not talking to anybody. He's not talking to Nina, his wife. He's not talking to any colleagues. He's not in contact with any foreign spy service. It's all going on inside his head. And it festers and grows and develops into a near spiritual, and I think fervour of hatred for the actual organisation for which he works, for the KGB. And it does sound quite odd, but he actually starts to visualise the KGB as a monster, as a creature. And this is where I think you have to understand the kind of Russian context of this very much. He sees himself as like a peasant hero from a Russian folktale, who is battling, in his mind, a dragon or a hydra with 3 heads. And those heads are the Communist Party, the nomenklatura, the elite, and the KGB, the Chekists, named after the Cheka, the original Soviet secret police. And he has this kind of intensity, a view of him being the one battling this evil creature which he sees feeding off the Russian people. And this is a long, and what I find fascinating about this, so he's banished to the archives in 1956, doesn't really start to do anything until 1972. So it's a 16-year process of these ideas growing. He does little things. He writes some letters anonymously, trying to hide who he is. But then in 1972, an opportunity comes because the KGB is moving from the first chief directorate from the centre of Moscow, from Lubyanka, out to a new headquarters where it still is, in the forest, as it's known, or the woods, on the outskirts of Moscow. And if you're moving, you move your archives. And by this stage, he's risen up the archives to be quite a senior archivist. So he's given the job of moving the archives. And of course, moving archives means you're deciding what you keep, what goes, what gets weeded, what needs to stay in this location or that location, all passing through his hands. And he realises he can do something to live out this ideal of fighting the beast. He can forge a weapon, and the weapon is the truth. And the truth lies in the files. And what he realises is he has access to the files. They're passing through his hands, his office, he can copy them. And he realizes to the point where he can sit, look at a file and write down on a tiny scrap of paper the details of it in his own kind of hieroglyphic style secret code, a kind of shorthand. And then most of the time he'll tuck it into his shoe and then walk out. It's very interesting because he understood how security worked. You can't walk out with a big wad of files. Security guards will spot you. But you can walk out with the little bit of paper in your shoes. And if you've got enough time, and he had time, you can do something very interesting with that. So out comes the little bit of paper, and then on the evening and the weekends, he would go to his apartment in Moscow, a dacha, and he would reconstitute the file from his notes. Someone described it to me, someone who knew him, as like taking a stock cube, which was condensed, and then pouring boiling water on it to restore it to a soup or original form. And that's what he would do in, lonely hours. And then he would take the new files and he would bury them in steel kind of milk churns, other receptacles, under the floorboards of his dacha. Just buried them. Strange, obsessive thing to do without really a plan, but you are getting a copy of the KGB's most secret archive under the floorboards of a dacha. And in his mind, he didn't have a plan. He hadn't contacted a Western spy service at this point. In a way, the fact he didn't have a plan was part of it. He saw himself as a dissident, an internal dissident within the Soviet Union, like the other dissidents. One of his models, I think, was Solzhenitsyn, the great writer, who also would do things like write his novels and his non-fiction works and bury them, hoping that one day they could be produced and published, writing for the drawer, as it was known in Russia, because it was too dangerous to publish. And so this is something he does over years. And it's a remarkable, slightly obsessive thing. This is not, he's taking huge risks with his life without a plan, but it goes to an individual's obsessiveness. And to cut the story short, he retires in '84, still works on the files. No plan, really. Comes up with some plans of maybe how he can get them out. But by the time you get to the late 80s, he's got so many, you can't carry them out. I mean, he's got boxes and boxes and boxes of the KGB's most secret records. You can't carry it out in a suitcase, you can't walk out with it. He's almost trapped by his own success. And then something quite surprising happens, which is that the Soviet Union kind of collapses in 1991. And particularly the borders weaken and the Baltic states go independent. So suddenly there's the ability for him to go over the border into the Baltic states and show people what he's done. And to his shock, the Americans don't seem interested, but the Brits do. I'm going to not tell the whole story about his dealings with Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, because that's what you have to read in the book. But what follows is a series of meetings. And I think one of the interesting thing is they're trying to work out, is he for real? How serious is he? How do we handle him? Is that he has two demands. He wants himself and his family to be extracted from the country, and he wants the archive published. Quite unusual for a spy to say, I want the material I've stolen to be published. But it goes back to his motivation. It was a weapon to attack these forces that he wanted to battle. And so eventually there's a remarkable exfiltration operation, which is recounted in the book, which involves not just Mitrokhin getting out, not just his wife Nina, who he's just told what he's been doing, but also his mother-in-law and their son, who by this stage is in a wheelchair. And British intelligence have to extract all of them out of Russia in a very unusual operation where they have a cover story that they're going to a health clinic for the son, which is a cover story for border guards, but it's also a cover story for the mother-in-law and the son, who don't know until the very last moment at the boat that they're actually being extracted, and leads to a very dramatic confrontation again. I won't go into all the details, got to buy the book. So he gets out with these files. Now this is, I think, the relevant part of the story to discuss, when we're thinking about today, because, okay, that could be the end of the story. Gets out, files are out, as you'd expect. Interestingly enough, there's one amusing bit, because even though the British had decided they really, he was valuable and they wanted to get him out. This being the moment the Cold War has ended, and some of you may well remember this, the interest in intelligence had dipped somewhat. And when it was asked of the Treasury, friends down the road at the Treasury, would they fund his new life in the UK? The Treasury went, no, no money. We haven't got £1 million. This isn't cash to give him. This is money for housing for him and the wider family. And they don't do it. And so, interestingly enough, the Brits then go back to the Americans and say, remember that guy you turned down? Do you think you could help out? And interestingly enough, the Americans, agree to effectively fund a lot of the retirement package, the resettlement package for him in return for full access to the files. And you might think the Americans are a bit grieved about this, but one of the people who was involved in this said to me, I'm not sure we got the worst end of the deal, because basically we paid the money, but we didn't have to deal with him. And he was really, really hard to deal with, which we'll come back to. So this material, and it's very interesting from a diplomatic point of view, because full of material about KGB operations. I haven't talked much about what's in it, but there's a wealth of material about what the KGB had been doing, not just in Western countries, but around the world. So in Iran, in India, in Africa, in Italy, as well as the UK and the US. Spies who'd never been caught, agents who were being paid, politicians who were on the payroll in many countries. Very sensitive material. One of the problems that British intelligence found was that they were going to partners, allies, and saying, we've got this very interesting material. And a good example was the French, which it turned out, you'll be shocked to hear, was packed full of communist agents who had never been discovered by the French. And this becomes quite awkward, because actually, if you're going to an ally and saying, well, great news, we found you've got a lot of spies inside your foreign ministry who you'd never found, and some of whom are still alive. The reaction from foreign governments is not great. Thanks. It's like, and this was one of the problems, is actually managing the wealth of secrets and the complexity of it became quite difficult and quite challenging in some ways. But another strange bit of the story is that Mitrokhin himself had left with his family, and it appears as if the Russian authorities didn't know it, didn't know he'd gone. I mean, I still find this slightly extraordinary, but you have to remember he'd retired from the KGB. And he lived, they had an apartment in Moscow, 2 dachas. The pension, by clever methods, was still being collected. And so people would think, well, he must be living at one of the other locations, and they've moved. And so the secret that he's gone is actually kept. And it appears as if the Russians really didn't know that their entire archive of the KGB's operations had been stolen. So for years, this is worked on in secret by Western counterintelligence services, MI5 here, and others. The interesting challenge comes with, of course, the fact that Mitrokhin himself had said, I want this published. This is my life's work. I'm not doing this because I want to be a spy. I'm doing this because I'm a dissident. I want to fight the powers that I think had corrupted my country. And so there'd always been a plan to publish parts of the archive. And in 1995, Christopher Andrew, many of you will know, the eminent Cambridge historian, was invited in to Vauxhall Cross, MI6 headquarters, to discuss doing a book. One of the things I discovered when writing this book, which is effectively a biography of Mitrokhin, is just how difficult that process was. And the relationship really did break down between Mitrokhin and MI6 and Christopher Andrew in quite a difficult way. At certain points, would get repaired. But it was partly because he was an obsessive man. I mean, he was normal people don't do the things he'd done. He was driven, he was obsessive. He, for instance, wanted the archive to be published in the raw, like literally the tiny notes, just to be published so people could see every detail. And I think Christopher Andrew and others felt that's not going to be comprehensible to anyone. It's fine if you understand the KGB and its operations, but not for anyone else. And so there was quite a high degree of tension, to the point where at one point Mitrokhin was like, "You've taken away my archive." He didn't have access to it at one point as well. I'm going to get lawyers involved. I'm going to exert copyright. And I think someone from inside British intelligence kind of quiet in their head thought, if anyone has a claim for copyright, it's the KGB. it's their archive. You know, don't know how we're going to manage that. And actually, the relationship is repaired. And sadly, you know, he's going through a lot of personal turmoil. His son had been quite upset at having been taken out away from his friends, and it would take many years for that relationship to evolve. By the time you get to 1999 and the book coming out, his wife Nina is also falling prey to a muscle wasting disease, very similar to the one the son. So it's quite he's not an easy person, and he's not in an easy place. But the book will come out in 1999. It's a quite famous book, quite big doorstep book, the Mitrokhin Archive, 2 volumes of it. You may have seen it. Now, this is where I think it gets very particularly interesting and pertinent for the present, because it doesn't make the impact that it should have done. Now, why? One reason is some of what he felt was his message, which was about the KGB, about its reach, about its willingness to do things that other spy services wouldn't do, about its kind of nefarious activities, wasn't the main focus of the book. Here in Britain, some of you will remember, I don't know how many people remember the name Melita Norwood, but that became the story around the book. And it's a very interesting story in its own right, an example of what was in the book, because it revealed there'd been an agent inside the British tube alloys program, which was the code name for the nuclear program, who had passed on incredibly valuable secrets to the KGB. And the agent's name, the book would reveal, was Melita Norwood. And what was more complicated was she was still alive, having done this in the early Cold War, and she was living in Bexley Heath in South London making jam. A journalist who was working on a documentary around the book, went to confront her, and she was there in her cardigan, and confessed, and said, "I'd do it all again." She's a true believer in communism. But this, and there was the wonderful line. She used to shop at the co-op, and so the headline was the spy who came in from the co-op, which I think is an excellent, as a journalist, an excellent headline. And one of the things someone told me was the reason they knew it was her and where it was because they went to the local newsagent and they said, "Well, there's one person who still gets the Morning Star delivered, the communist newspaper, every morning, and it's that Melita Norwood who lives down the road." And they were like, "That sounds like our person." But it's interesting, and I mean, I was talking, I don't know how many of you were at the Richard Moore event the other week, and I was talking to Jack Straw about it afterwards, because Jack had been Home Secretary at the time, and was blindsided, actually, by the revelation when it came out in the book, because there was then a huge scandal, which was, why had Melita Norwood not been prosecuted? And she'd actually been, as we say these days, on the radar of MI5 at one point, and on the periphery, but they'd missed how significant she was. And so there was a big political scandal about why Melita Norwood had not been prosecuted by MI5, what had gone wrong within government, the handling of the Mitrokhin material. This became the story, as ever. Kind of politics, domestic politics takes over and becomes the story. And it kind of overshadowed everything, and it led to an Intelligence and Security Committee, an ISC investigation into Mitrokhin, which is quite useful for me because the report that came out of it had tons of great detail. Thank you very much to the ISC. That became the story, rather than what Mitrokhin wanted to be the story. But something else was going on at that moment, because the book comes out September 1999. Within weeks of it coming out, Vladimir Putin is made Prime Minister of Russia. And it's a very interesting moment, because at the moment the book comes out, the view is the Cold War is over. Spies, it's all very interesting about Melita Norwood, Cambridge spies, but this is the past. This book, this Mitrokhin Archive, it's about things that happened in the past and which we no longer need to worry about. When the reality was, some aspects of the KGB had persisted through the dark, humiliating, in their view, days of the 1990s, and were returning to power. And Vladimir Putin, of course, a former KGB man. A former KGB man was at that moment returning to power in Moscow, literally as the Mitrokhin Archive is being published. But no one quite sees it. And even people I spoke to who were in, the secreter bits of the British state at the time would say that they thought they didn't quite see some of the risks or what it become. The view was this is someone maybe who can bring about order and stability after the chaos of the 1990s. And yet, Mitrokhin could see it. And it's very interesting because I went through his writings in the following years of his life after 1999. And they are fascinating because he can see that this beast that he'd been fighting was not dead. He could see that it was resurgent. He could see that it had changed shape. It had changed form, but actually the Chekists, the KGB, the Cheka, was still alive and persistent. And there was a continuous thread running through the Russian history of the century. And he was trying to warn people about it and trying to talk about it. And yet, people didn't listen. And this isn't a kind of criticism of any other people. I was a journalist at the time. Did I understand that? Not sure I did. But he could see it because, of course, he knew the KGB better than literally, I would argue, anyone alive. I mean, he'd been an officer of it for decades and had been the archivist. He knew its deepest secrets. And so there is an element of his story which I think is tragedy. In a way, it's a hugely successful intelligence operation. He does something extraordinary. He gets in contact with British intelligence. He is extracted from the country. The material is published. On the one hand, I think you can say that that's a very successful outcome. And yet, I feel there is an element of tragedy because I think we did not see what he was trying to say. And the arguments in his later years become much more clearer that the old is not past, he writes about. And one of the things, to bring it up to date that, I do reflect on is that, and again, self-critical about this, is that we spend a lot of time going, well, is there Russian political interference? Is Russian intelligence, carrying out active measures? Is it doing sabotage operations? Shock horror. If you read the Mitrokhin archive, it is all there. It is all there in the archive. Exactly these kinds of activities. The old is not past. It has changed. Some of the tactics have changed. They can use cyber espionage and cyber disinformation. In the past, they used to have to plant articles in foreign newspapers to spread disinformation. But the fundamental strategies of the KGB, of Russian intelligence, have not changed and are described quite clearly in the Mitrokhin archive. And yet, we forgot those lessons, and we didn't learn those lessons. And it's taken years for us to kind of understand and to see the connectivity of the Putin of today and of what he is willing to do and what Russian spy services are willing to do and the kind of activities that they take place. And we should not be shocked by that. And they are even quite explicit about it in interesting ways. So I meant to mention this idea of the Cheka. And so the Soviet secret police in its original founding was the Cheka, and the people who were members of it called themselves Chekists, and their boss was Felix Dzerzhinsky, the original founder of the Cheka, just after the revolution. What you see is an absolute continuity that even though the KGB has gone, even though the communist ideology, which how far it was central to the KGB and to the Soviet state, I think is an interesting question, certainly on the surface. But even once that is stripped away, they will still refer to themselves today as Chekists. No such thing as a former Chekist. Putin himself sees himself as a Chekist. Chekist Day was reinstituted in Russia. Very interesting. I mean, this was a kind of pretty bloody organisation, and yet, self-referentially, the leaders of not just the Russian intelligence services, but the Russian state, because the two things have overlapped and become almost one, see themselves as Chekists within the tradition that Mitrokhin talked about. And one of the interesting moments is, Dzerzhinsky, this head, the statue of Dzerzhinsky is taken down famously outside the Lubyanka in August 1991 by protesters. Very famous scene where it's toppled, great cheers, and in the Lubyanka inside they were fearful about what that meant. Well, just in the last couple of years, a new statue of Dzerzhinsky was put up outside the current headquarters of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR. A direct link, if you like, a direct symbol of what they perceive as the persistence of this ideology and of the Chekist notion, despite the fact, that this was someone who served supposedly the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, no, people are not talking about being Bolsheviks today, and yet they talk about being Chekists. What does that tell you about Russia and about the mindset of the Russian security state? I think it's very interesting and perhaps not entirely understood, and yet that was the message and the warning that Mitrokhin carried with him from the archives. And to finish his story, as I come to a close, he dies in 2004, fortunately of natural causes. These days you have to kind of stress that because it's not always the case with Russians in Britain. But his, one of the, on a personal level, one of the things I found powerful was that his son, having been found coming to the UK quite difficult, then takes up his father's work, and he is the one who deposits the papers of his father, the Mitrokhin archive itself, the raw data in Churchill College, Cambridge. And you can go see almost all of it. It's a few bits which are still secret, interesting enough. But you can go and see that in Churchill College, Cambridge. And people I speak to are still mining it, finding secrets, finding stories about what happened in various parts of the world, Armenia, Israel, Italy, which are resonant and which matter. And so there is a legacy there, which I think is very important and which has been left by Mitrokhin. And I think his story, therefore, is an important one. It's a kind of dramatic spy story. It's a very interesting human story. But I think most importantly, it tells us something about Russia and about the Chekist ideology and about the importance of not forgetting our history and understanding it. So thank you.